Yes, this is lovely. First, I just want to say that it is so lovely to read with Rowan and Tomas, two of my favorite poets and favorite humans. I'm lucky to call you friends and mentors. So thanks for doing this with me. So we wanted to curate a reading around the theme of animals and creatures and critters. I think all three of us hold a pretty special place in our hearts for animals, and they show up a lot in our writing. They visit our poems. So we thought it would be fun to kind of pull out those pieces and read them together. And I'll be reading from Red List Blue, which one of the themes in this book really grapples with this moment of mass extinction through which we are all living as a result of climate change and other environmental catastrophes. So they're not all going to be super heavy, but some of them will be, and I'm sorry for that, but I'll just jump in. Bioluminescent. I sink through the water down to where sand firms underfoot. No wave can move my body. Each wave moves me. And all around the beach shines, waves and sand up to the rack line. I drift like a whale filtering plankton through baleen, their tiny bodies on my tongue, in my blood, until my skin flickers blue and green. I am a constellation, stars over a new moon. My body a mirror floating just below the waves. The ocean also comes up a lot in my work, which is odd because I've lived most of my life in Vermont. I can't explain it. This is called On Watching a Video of Sea Creatures Swimming Through Trash. It's the stingrays that get me. In the aquarium's touch and feel tank, how they look like improbable birds or gentle dinosaurs. Their backs, velvet-stained rubber, toned muscle relaxed under a lover's grip. Imagine a kitten riding one like a horse or snuggled under the flap as if it were a blanket. My personal longings are one thing, how I always wished to live by the sea, but never did. We all buy things we don't need, reads the caption, folding us together in a cool sheet of shrink wrap. Spare earbuds protected in 3 layers of packaging, discarded on the car floor. Boxed rice, individual yogurt cups and seltzer cans, extra plastic grocery bags for tossing soiled cat litter. Seagulls pick at old food on top of landfill heaps. Their beaks pull up long strings of wire. A tree in my backyard grows around a tire, giving the illusion the earth will heal over our nonsense. Oceans so wide. Just look at the tide come in. Undefined. The first clearing we've seen in weeks. Small, a blue sky morning over half the yard. Snow still floats in shifts. Miniature paper cranes sent on an angled air current, then held. Sent down, then held. Crows perch on the tangled branches of a fallen tree. A blue jay on the edge of the woods tricks my eyes a moment, seems to be something larger. Remember lying on your bed under the skylight, among tree boughs, wondering at the underside of a giant jay. Could it be a hawk? No, wrong color. I felt safe exclaiming with you falsely over backyard wildlife. It seemed such a normal moment, one for lovers. Certitude of motion. This morning, a pileated woodpecker with its enormous red crest flew low over the roof of my car while I moved down the highway in slow commuter traffic. I flinched as though it might crash into my hair. Thank God, it stayed in the air. Once, another woodpecker zipped into the trees inches ahead of a passing truck. The driver bore down on his brakes to barely miss it. But later, biking back by the same spot, I spied a pool of blood and red feathers lying in the middle of the road. At my desk, arrived and unharmed, I listen now to a hammer swing and knock against a nail in the nearby lumberyard. I swear I can hear it, the knocking of its body against my windshield, the body falling from the sky. So where I grew up, there were several fields behind my mom's house, and one of them, at least 1 year, maybe more, I'm not sure, but it was host to just like so many monarch butterflies. And so my brother and I named it the Monarch Meadow, and that name always stuck. So this is called Monarch Meadow. The round hay bales ran over with baby garter snakes, olive and yellow ribbons that slid over our palms, the lot of us competing to see who could be the most indifferent, who could hold the snakes without flinching. Of course I didn't win. Sleek striped caterpillars crawled in masses over grass and milkweed. When I was alone, I closed my eyes to dream of growing. Time moved the way a rainbow fades, while caterpillars silently measured my limbs and the strands of my hair, mapping my neck and ankles. They gave way to monarchs, so many we gave the meadow its name and kept it long after the monarchs left. Back then, the air was so orange and shifting, it may have been a flame. Summer was slipping. A residue hung in the late afternoon, then fell. I left before night came on, but imagine the field filled with fireflies in summer, and in winter, only ghosts. The same ghosts my brother said came into the house at night to shatter bottles and leave holes in the walls. We both left on bedside lamps so as not to endure the dark, and I'd lie awake for hours, listening. In daylight, I could hold the future. I was sure. I did not know the new farm would pick apart the bales and till the milkweed under. That monarchs would starve mid-migration, that they were half ghosts already, fluttering before my eyes. So there's a website you can go to. It's called the Red List, and it's part of where the name for this collection comes from. And on the Red List, it kind of categorizes every extinct, endangered, and threatened species, and tracks them and moves them around to the different categories depending on how they're doing. And it's used by conservation organizations to kind of prioritize where they're going to put funding and efforts. And I became obsessed with this list for a little while, and wanted to write a poem about it. And I started imagining what it would be like to be like the web developer who has to update the list, just like on from the tech end. So this is written from that imagined person's perspective. Updating the Red List. Extinct. Extinct in the wild, regionally extinct, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened. The Red List, a menagerie of unpronounceable Latin, pixelated faces, tree limbs, ferns. I click and drag each picture to its place, count the lost and the losing, guess genus and region by common name alone before I read the notes. It's easier with my silent game, pretending I can win. I like to open the window while I work, listen to the birds. I tell myself it's not just a funeral song, no elegy, Someone will listen. So I read and type and try not to memorize the names, try not to say them with my full voice, ever a whisper. The birdsong grows quieter each morning. At the bottom of each page, a button says, "Show more." Got just two more for you. We're gonna shift our animal focus to a little more domestic. I'm gonna focus on my cat. I spend a lot of time with her. This is called The Gamble. Though it could close her airways to bite into the greenery, my new kitten beats playfully at the peace lily I'd hoped she would avoid. Her white paws are rapid fire. The elephant ears bend and drum as if shaking in rain. Her eyes twitch. Her tail tip cuts smooth through the air, left, then right. She opens her jaws, and a passing puff of dust distracts her. Now she's a wild thing crouched beneath a leaf. I follow her gaze, look where she looks, the gray beyond the window. A day so hazy, anything could be there. A white Bengal tiger stalking an elephant in the neighbor's driveway. The elephant flapping her ear like a flag in mist. In the swimming pool, a shark fin splits the water. Everything goes gray, gray, gray. Coming up from the bottom of the deep end, a mermaid hits her highest note, wagering her voice away. A minute to 7, and the light comes up misty, rained upon, still sounding of crickets. All night I woke on and off to their trill and the fear that I'd rise too late to write, the only practice I know to hold with my small and sufficient God. But I came to on time, and as I finish this pre-dawn seance, the garden emerges out the window. The rain falls barely. My cat listens at the door for the scratch of my slippers, my rousing to feed her. I've sat here for more than an hour and am quietly in love with the morning. Whatever terror is in the world today, may we meet it with a gentle rise.
Thank you, Lizzy. That was fantastic. I'll remind everybody I'm keeping you all on mute as per usual to just keep it on background noise for our readers. Very lovely reading. And I am recording as well. So if you know someone who couldn't be here tonight, or if you want to rewatch the reading, it will be available on the Kellogg-Hubbard Library website. And you're welcome to put comments and questions in the chat. We'll also open up at the end of the reading for people to ask questions in person. So feel free to do that a little later too. So it is my pleasure to introduce Rowan next. Rowan Quince Buckton grew up along the Hudson River and holds an MFA in writing from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Pank Magazine, Hayden's Ferry Review, The Writer's Chronicle, Grist Journal, and elsewhere, has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and received an honorable mention in the 2018 AWP Intro Journals Project. She lives on an island off the coast of Washington in the Salish Sea, where she works as a librarian and serves as senior poetry editor for 3 Elements Literary Review. Rowan, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here this evening. And Lizzy, thank you for that reading. It's always such a joy to hear you read, and even a greater pleasure to read alongside you and Tomas this evening. I'm just so grateful, and thank you. When Lizzy graciously invited me to join her for this reading, and we were deciding and curating that topic, and we started to lean into the area of animals, I thought, well, I do have a lot of dead animal poems, which is a very uncomfortable notion to even just reflect and acknowledge, let alone say aloud. And I like to think that that is just part of what happens when you work on a farm in Vermont for a summer. So I hope that you'll forgive me. Ricochet. This wasn't the first challenge. I should have known better than to scold Russell for brandishing the BB gun. He'd skinned the chipmunk, nailed the body to wood scrap, drowned the coat in salt to preserve it, left it leaning against the edge of my bed. We'll kill anything that eats the basil. Nate shot himself in the foot or the elbow, a ricochet that bunched his skin into an ugly ruffle. I named the duck that couldn't walk, carried him everywhere. Russell warned, the ones with names always die first. I couldn't figure out how to make the job less precious, grasping the newborn turkeys one at a time, an hour to empty a single coop. The other hands would scoop them into a fluttering heap. But why not dote on the markings of each feather? That swollen split pea of an eye. I killed the first by accident, its leg mashed beneath a metal water bowl. They were moths, frenetic with light, wings all beating towards something. A dreadful circus parade of knobbed feet and open mouths. Someone picked the chicken up by the foot, the carcass hanging. Bigger than the baby turkeys, a dead, full-bodied thing. This was before Lizzy learned how to cleave an animal's body in two. Before she said she knew the best way to kill them. I'm sure none of us meant to leave it in the bucket. Didn't intend for the flies or the stink. At first, we thought the tomatoes had soured, but then its odor turned like the summer the mouse died inside the wall, and we had to wait the stench out. And I was the one to dispose of it, because I was the most afraid. And now we'll transition from Vermont farms to 1920s New Jersey, as one does. The physics of falling, 2. I shouldn't tell you how I wish I was one of the girls who straddled the horses that dove off Atlantic City's steel pier. The girls led the horses along a steel, carpeted 40-foot ramp. I don't even flinch at the story of Sonora Carver, whose retinas detached upon impact. Her eyes hit the water open. Sometimes the girls broke bones in the garden of legs, trying to paddle to the end of the pool. If you could only see their bodies midair. Have I told you how their torsos pointed straight down? A jet of milk out of the carton, like when we posed toys skyward and stilled before we understood the laws of physics, and after still because we wanted to believe a different story. Arachnid. I wish someone had taught me the beauty in a roach's crazed desire for light. A centipede's urge for swiftness across the naked floor. The grace in a daddy long leg's knee bend. All of that leg pushing toward balance. So that at least I could cherish one of them. A whole wilderness of the marvelous ugly. I've seen them for days, in the wrinkles of my bedspread, crossing the mockingjay blue of my breakfast plate, always a scurry and flash. The Ultimate Dictionary of Dream Language says that spider sightings presage a powerful force protecting against self-destructive behavior. Tonight, I rescued a cricket, trapped it under a Tupperware container, and slid an electric bill beneath its sleeping shell. I tried to imagine his violin string legs as weapon, those great folding things that carve out sound against the blank of night. How does the body choose repulsion? I don't steal away from woolly caterpillar, stink bug, or beetle. I once heard of a woman who catapulted her car into a metal rail after spotting an aphid on the inside of her windshield. Its body smaller than a papaya seed. I still cannot kill the common house spider, too afraid to near its torso. You are afraid of frogs, their throats bludgeoning song. Even the smallest encroach pose danger, their limbs elastic mayhem. Once at an aquarium, one sat so large I thought it an amphibian mannequin. Its torso was bigger than my hand crushed into yours, urging away and toward the electric eel. I haven't told you that I used to search for toads after heavy rain, cup them in my palm and carry them out of roadways and sidewalks to safety. Neither of us have learned to pocket fear. You remove all of the spiders in our home now. Slide mason jars over their fearsome limbs and cradle them outside. Evenings when you cringe against the frogs' bloated melodies, I am ready to scoop them by the armfuls. No glass, no sheath of paper. It's been such a pleasure to join you all this evening and to have a sense of community near and far. And I love seeing my folks from the Pacific Northwest here and my Vermont community as well. And I will leave you with this poem. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Kellogg-Hubbard Library and to Michelle as well. Before Garrison Keillor, a dogfight. We knew it would happen before it happened. Before the dog dug into the other dog's body. Before we tried to forget the other dog was a dog because we didn't want to see something die in front of us. The owner of the make-believe dying thing was screaming and kicking the dog with the teeth. They were all screaming. They took up all the sound in the park. The rest of us only had eyes. We were too afraid to open our mouths and remember that we, too, had teeth. But the little girl who chased after the animal with canines called it by name. Cookie, or Clem, or Coco, or Kiki. Not a killer's name. We didn't have any hands to move her, any knees to kneel on, any tongues to clack her away. Thank you.
Thank you, Rowan. It is really nice to have a group of people here. This is one of the, as you all know, one of the unexpected benefits of this time is that we get to be together with people that we if this were at the Kellogg-Hubbard Library in the Hayes Room, we wouldn't have had you, Rowan, and that's hard to imagine. So it's really nice to be together with people from everywhere on this Saturday. Next, Tomás Q. Morin is the author of the forthcoming poetry collection Machete, as well as the forthcoming memoir, Let Me Count the Ways. He is co-editor of the anthology Coming Close, 40 Essays on Philip Levine, and translator of The Heights of Machu Picchu by Pablo Neruda. He teaches at Rice University and Vermont College of Fine Arts. Tomás, it's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Michelle. thanks to you and the Kellogg-Hubbard Library for inviting me and having me be a part of what's really a joy for me to read with Lizzy and Rowan. I mean, I'd read with them about any topic, any day of the week. It's yeah, I've just been so looking forward to this reading. I'm going to read a few poems, one from each of my books. This first one is the first poem that opens my collection, A Larger Country, my first book. And the first time I read this poem it was 2009 at the Red Loaf Writers Conference. Shortly after the reading, someone outside the building said, "Hey, the animal poet." And I remember thinking like, no, like I can't be in a pigeonhole already. Like, I don't even have a book. How can I be the animal poet? I really resisted that for a while. Now I don't really care. So I don't really usually set out to write a poem about an animal. This one is an exception. They usually just slip in, crawl or swim or slide into my poems. But this one is about Laika, the Russian cosmonaut, the dog that went first member of our earthly species to enter space. Laika. In 1957, Sputnik 2 carried her into space, where the first bark went unheard. Did she lick herself or nip at the whir of the fan in that cabin? These concerns were not important to science, unlike velocity, heart rate, time of death. When my faith in justice wavers, I embrace my inner Greek and butcher the sky, carve out a swath of stars catching a curve of light millions of years old, and pretend they are the outline of a dog, half husky, half terrier. I retreat to this fantasia when another report of animal cruelty soils further the already filthy news. It was years before we knew she didn't last more than 5 hours in that wretched kennel, weightless. And think of the trash she could have rooted, the black boots she could have shined with the few well-placed curtsies in deference to the great mutts of history. Think Khrushchev and Kennedy. Sweet Laika, it has been decades since my last confession, and my sins are many. In Kathmandu, I herded strays through the alleys, ticked their foreheads and paws red, wept in gratitude when they licked my face, because now they might let me pass through the gates of heaven with only a tender snarl for having diced garlic. May the bulbs forgive me in the kitchens of Laos. I went my whole life without seeing a dog struck by a car, and then it was there. Have mercy upon the pronoun. I didn't get out. In the mirror, watching the Chevys and Fords pounding the pavement with its tail before the truck hauling from Georgia, who knows what. And it was in that other Georgia, the colder one, where I entered the life of a minor scientist, hunting the bakeries of Moscow for tea cake one day, the trash heaps the next, for any dog the size of a bread box, one not much bigger than the tabby at the foot of my bed, dreaming about the injustice of wings, unaware of my past allegiances, that I was born under the sign of the dog, that I have lived and died a traitor to my own kind. Nature Boy. If I had enough cages to keep all the birds I've collected over the years, then I would have to open a shop, because there's only so much room in a 2-bedroom walk-up for 48 birds, not to mention the dancing bears and the frogs, or the different varieties of fish, the one species of flea. And I almost forgot the proud dogs and the lone mule, the profane one who entered my life to curse at scribes and Pharisees. And maybe he'd let the mouse I found forever dying at the end of a poem ride on his back like a whiskered Christ. And if not, maybe my Yeti could do it when he's not downtown working security at the store or teaching the parrots how to say brotherhood in grunt and how to comb out the tangles and mud from his hair, whose sweat reminds me of that bearded collector of beasts with the ark who would have no doubt understood how I feel, that prophet of change, under whose spell I want to confess that I'm a Christian of the Old Testament, that my grandfather hung all his goats upside down, their throats over a bucket, and slapped their chests, like that other nature boy who strutted around the ring like a peacock with his feathered hair that stayed immaculate, even on the nights he lost to our hero, Wahoo McDaniel, who never played the heel. He who hailed from the lost tribes of Oklahoma, who made us want to be chiefs so much we wore pigeon feathers and circled each other inside a green square of water hose until someone finally rang the bell that was never there, and we sprang toward each other like animals in love or at war. This last poem is called Machetes. I wrote a poem once that I called Machete. It was angry because I was angry when I wrote it. Angry over white supremacy and blah, blah, blah. It's okay if you haven't read it, because it only had one machete in it, and everyone knows a poem with multiple machetes always trumps a poem with a single one. Can we reclaim that word yet? You know the one I'm talking about. Don't make me say it again. So if you're one of the few billion people who hasn't read my machete poem, the recap goes like this. A single machete, gold and shiny, descended from the Aztec heaven of jaguars and naked women on flea market paintings. That joke was going to be longer, but I can't keep a straight face for more than 6 lines, even when the lines are as short as these are. The truth is that poem was about weaponizing my smile by giving it a sharp blade to slice all the white supremacists inside that poem, the ones who I made dance like fields of cane. Notice how I went all in with the passive voice just then, how I implied my poem did this and my poem did that, instead of saying I was responsible for those choices that felt right and still do. That poem does contain one lie that I feel bad about, which is silly, because what poem doesn't contain a lie or two? Even so, this one bothers me. So here's my confession. At the end of that poem, I said, I drink coffee. I don't. Never have. Why don't you drink coffee? People always ask. I don't like the taste, is what I say. And that, well, that's a truth you can carve on my headstone without disturbing my sleep. What has kept me up for months now is the feeling that I forgot to put something in that single machete poem. I've sat cold in my burrow, washing my whiskers, tuning my ears to the gentle footfalls of that feeling that has been stalking me for days and days. I didn't know what it was until I heard Chen Chen read in snowy Vermont. His dark jacket and pants were pinstriped like a cage for the soft leopard shirt he wore. I don't think I'd seen him since we had been teammates for the Poetry World Series with Erica M. And even though we won the game, the real victory came while we waited on the corner of Crosby and Houston for the crosswalk signal, when he and I decided we would go west to Miss Lily's and the group could go where it wanted, because we didn't want a sports bar, because we didn't want American food, because we didn't want to take orders from the white woman we didn't know who put herself in charge of the group that night. Now, I'm not saying she was a white supremacist, but she was wielding something heavy and blunt and invisible. And really, shame on her for forgetting that just 10 minutes before, Our team had bested that all-star lineup of Melissa and Adrian and Erica S. after 9 close innings. Couldn't she see we all had crowns? Chen, do you remember how everyone smiled and said they'd join us when we said we were going our own way? Maybe they tapped into their inner cats in that moment and could smell the jerk chicken and the fried plantains already sizzling a short half-mile away. Do you remember the size of my eyes when I whispered that we had passed Cuba Gooding Jr. on the way to our booth? I know. Show me the money is the quote from Jerry Maguire everyone remembers. But for me, it's always been the thing Cuba's character says about Quan, how it means love, respect, community, and dollars, the entire package. And I know if we talk about Quan in the poetry world, then the dollars part becomes a punchline, which is okay, because laughter is what I forgot to put in that poem with a single machete. But Chan, you reminded me anger can also be funny when I heard you read that poem about cats. Was it the one about dogs? And this was a truth I had always known, or at least something I had known for a very long time, but had forgotten the day I sat down to write my smile into a machete I could use against my enemies. But you, in your poems, broke the stillness of that cold night in a chapel I'm not sure was ever meant for laughter. And so I stepped out of my burrow, smiling, just as I did this morning when I woke from a dream in which I was a house cat. I was a tortie. With every step, my legs grew longer, and my shoulders churned like discs of a plow under my skin that was now golden, like the color of wet limestone. I stretched taller and longer until my teeth and legs and claws, even my tail that was now as long as my body, all felt lethal like machetes. I'd forgive anyone who, seeing me like this, said I was a beautiful death machine, like Karen the Cougar in Talladega Nights, a role that was played by 2 mountain lions named Dylan and KC, who like to roll around in the grass between takes. I like to think I'm a beautiful life machine, but I know that will be a hard sell for some readers because it is now a poem filled with many machetes. And how can a reader ever tell when I'm being angry funny or funny angry if they won't cast off their clothes and embrace that wild inner something that roams inside all of us and join me over a pile of spare ribs, our lips smacking, stripes of sauce on our cheeks, not unlike how it was in the beginning for our species, before we had words for what a life was, or someone to say, we must change it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to open up for questions. You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask any of the poets a question if you like. There's a great comment. It says, really proud to be in the world making stuff with you 3. And so I could pitch one kind of question about how the artist and poet in you kind of feels in this moment in time as we're starting to transition out of this last year, and how that feels to you as an artist.
We're all waiting for someone else to go first.
Very much.
Yeah, good question. I don't know that. So this last year, I have started a new career, which is a very strange time to change careers. So I actually haven't been doing a lot of writing in the last year. So I think that's a hard question for me to reflect on because I haven't been tapping into my artistry in the ways that I normally do. So from what I hear from other writers in my life, that's maybe not such an uncommon experience in the last year, just in general, that it's been, I think, tough for a lot of folks to tap into that. So I don't know, I guess I feel like eager to get back to my artistry and hopeful that I'll be able to soon. That's not a very profound answer. I don't know, Rowan, do you have a, are you unmute?
I was going to, remarkably say it's been a really uncomfortable year. I mean, creatively speaking, I definitely have not been producing a tremendous amount of work, and I think I've been focused on revision, but I felt somewhat separate from the work that I've created before, and some of it just doesn't feel, I feel like I want to say really different things now than I did a year ago, which is not, I could say that at any point, but there's this distinct before and after right now, I also moved across the country, and so I'm acclimating in my own way here too. Yeah. I did want to say that I remembered when Tomas was reading that the first reading that Lizzy and I did together, we read one of Tomas's poems as the opening to that reading. It was Golden Record that we read. And so there was this really beautiful moment where I was like, oh, we've come full circle. So we have that moment of the evening. But yeah, I mean, I think I've been riding the wave of the year creatively in some ways, and trying to offer myself some gentleness around that. Yeah,
It does feel very full circle, like in answer to your question, Michelle. I tend to write very slow, usually about 4 poems a year is my max. So like even in like during the pandemic, if I only crank out like 2 poems in a year, it's like, well, hey, I was halfway there. It feels like a lot. But actually last year, I think I wrote 6 or 7. So it was like a really sort of productive year in that sense. And I think this year I've only written 1. But yeah, so it's, I don't know. I just, in a sense, the year, I think last year was maybe really productive because I'd been working on a memoir for quite a while, and that had really diminished the amount of poems I was writing. Like I had a couple of years where I didn't write any at all. So I think it was, there were a bunch that were in the corral that were just waiting to get out, so once the memoir got taken and it was like, okay, it's poetry time. Yeah, a lot of them just kind of came out regardless of what was going on, yeah.
This is Ron Jackson. I have a question.
Hey, Ron, how are you?
Pretty good, Tomas. Hi, Lizzy. Hi, Rowan. I don't think we've met, but hello. I haven't met Lizzy, at least online. Anyway, here's my question. I've been reading, I've been doing more I did my MFA at BCFA in fiction, but I've been writing poetry, and I'm trying to get stimulation from all kinds of places, and I'm hearing different views on how poems get started. And I was wondering, for all of you, if you could just chime in on what your tendency is in terms of, do you more often start with an idea and then look for the material and scale of the idea to fit that? Or do you start with a blank mind and go with whatever comes up and then let that take you to, step B, and then let that take you somewhere else, and then just, have a world of surprises for yourself in the poem? So that I hope that came out as 2 opposites there. But that's my question.
Don't everyone answer at once.
No, I'm like looking at Tomas. I can't tell if Tomas is looking at me. We're having this quiet standoff. Thanks for your question, Ron. I think it varies for me, and I'm a person that typically has a lot of resistance to writing exercises. And so when I was in the program, for example, when we had a writing exercise, I was like, oh, well, this just is not going to go well for me. I'm not going to produce a lot out of this. And so I sometimes in the last year have been working a little bit with various writing constraints, because that sometimes can produce some interesting things for me. And have found some exercises that actually work. But for the most part, I would say that I approach the page pretty blank and just try to afford myself the ability to be messy and to know that it's an entrance, and that one of my favorite phrases that Tomas said in his teaching is that you can't break a poem. And so finding that entrance is usually pretty open for me. There are certainly images that I've carried around for years that I know want to be in a poem, and I don't know exactly where they will land. And it's interesting to see the way that they arrive in different places. And I also have heard other writers speak about when they're creating a book-length manuscript, when they're reading through that and finding the gaps in the book and like poems that need to answer back, for example. And that's kind of work that I have been doing. And that's been entirely different to assign myself, oh, now you're going to write this poem on this topic. And that's been somewhat new for me.
So as a side question, Rowan, when that happens, when you start with this answer or some idea, do you still allow yourself surprises and that moment to moment valuing the experience of the moment, the nowness of it?
I would say absolutely. I think there's a lot of danger in knowing, like presuming to know the end of the poem or the goal of the poem before you write it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say it's similar for me too, in that I often start with an image or just with a free write. And on the one area where I think Rowan and I are different often in our writing process is that I love writing exercises. I love prompts. They help me so much. But often, the prompt is just like, I journal for a few pages, I just rewrite, and then I look back and I grab a couple of words and say, okay, I have to use these words in a poem, and that's enough to get me kind of going. But I often find that I don't discover what I'm talking about until several drafts in. And I had the experience in putting together Red List Blue. Actually, that poem, Updating the Red List, was one of those poems that I saw like, oh, there needs to be, like, there's this gap. There needs to be something kind of holding these different species lost poems together. And that was one of the hardest poems for me to write, I think, because I knew what the topic was already, and I don't normally. So I kind of froze it took me a long time to figure out the way in. For folks who do like prompts and who do like exercises, I do just want to plug another VCFA alum, Sammy LeBou, recently came out with a book of writing prompts. And I'm blanking on the name of it, but I can go grab it because I've been working with it these last few weeks, and it has really helped to start getting back into a writing practice. So I'm gonna go find it.
For me, Ron, I oftentimes when I get an idea for a poem, it's usually like an image, or my poems tend to have. I tend to write narrative poems. So like I'll get ideas for a setting or something about that might create some dramatic tension, a character, might pop in my mind doing something, usually don't have time when this happens to sit down and just start writing it. So I'll take some notes, and like those moments for me it's something akin to, I don't know, like getting a notification from the stork that there's like a bouncing baby boy with, brown hair and green eyes. It's going to be delivered whenever I'm ready. I just gotta, let them know. And like that moment is when I'm ready to write the poem. So then it's about, it's almost like a visitation. like the poem, the sort of like the elements for the poem come. And with regards to surprise, like as soon as it feels like the poem is like up and walking around, which usually happens about halfway through that first draft, then it's about, in a way, kind of figuring out what the poem wants to be. And any preconceived ideas I had about what I wanted it to be just completely go out the window. At that point, it's my responsibility is to figure out what's the best way to sort of parent this poem, to get it through its angsty teenage years, which might be like draft, 12, until it gets to like a final form, and then it's out in the world. And I always used to think of it that way before I ever became a parent. Now that I am a parent, I'm like, oh yeah, it's exactly like that. Except with the poems is a lot faster, it's a lot faster. But so there's a lot of surprise.
So Tomas and others, there's a kind of corollary question to that. That is, at a certain point in a poem, when it's old enough, if you think of it as a child, my experience in stories and now in poetry a little bit too, is that it starts to tell you what it wants to be when it grows up. And do you have that experience at all? Where where you have that feeling that you're just channeling something that you put out there and is taking on a life of its own, and kind of like you kind of become an amanuensis for the poem kind of experience. Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, for me, yeah, I don't feel like I'm a medium. I feel like I'm more of a shepherd. Because I mean, if I don't write the next poem that is sort of given to me to write, someone else will, and that's okay. It'll get into the world in some way or another. That's ultimately what matters.
Hi, I'm Robin.
Hi, Robin.
I just was really so impressed with the different ways that the topic animals was viewed by all the artists. And I was curious, even though we're still in the throes of the pandemic of COVID, animals themselves have been, first and foremost, I think, really positively affected by COVID in the cleaner air and the less people out and about. There were goats that were wandering around a Welsh town during the height of the shutdown. And so many puppies and kittens were adopted during COVID. And we're also coming up here in New York to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So with all of those intersections for the artists as poets, do you see yourself or predict that at any point you will be inspired by the pandemic in your work as poets?
It's a good question. I mean, in relation to specifically around like pandemics and animals together, or just the pandemic in general?
Pandemic in general.
In general. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, for me anyway, like the things that come into my life are what I write about. So in that sense, like the pandemic will be in my poems, whether I put it there intentionally or not. And I don't currently, the little bit of writing that I have been doing has not directly been addressing the pandemic. And I think often for me, it's hard to directly address something that big while you're still in it. And I think probably if and when I write about it, it will be more likely be in retrospect. That's just a guess. I heard I forget which editor this was, but there was an editor who came to talk with some folks at the writing and publishing program at BCFA when I was still working there. And I wasn't at the talk, but the students kind of relayed it to me later, and how she had basically said, like, don't do it, resist the urge to write about, you know, being cooped up and wearing your pajamas, and of just like predicting seeing this same kind of poem over and over and over again coming out in the next year. So that's kind of lived in the back of my mind, but I mean, whatever's going to come out is what's going to come out. There's not much.
You know, it's
Yeah, I
about
can't fight against it. Sorry, Rowan. You go.
When I heard your question, I had also just read Rhonda's question in the chat. And so one of the things that I was thinking about is kind of like, yeah, I think that it will invariably affect my work because the animal of my body is experiencing the pandemic, right? So I have had those moments already where it's kind of slithered into work, but not in ways that feels good or productive yet. I don't know what it feeling good would feel like in this moment, but T, didn't you have a poem that came out in an anthology that had to do specifically with the pandemic?
Yeah, it's called the book is called Together in a Sudden Strangeness.
Mm-hmm.
The editor is Alice Quinn, and she collected many poems from contemporary poets. Many of us sort of wrote on assignment in a way, and yeah, I was fortunate enough to have her choose a poem that I sent her to put in there. But I'd had an idea, sort of like, as I mentioned earlier, this was sort of basic sketch for this poem for probably at least a year. So the sketch, the notes for the poem predated the pandemic. So then it was like, well, there's a call for this, this anthology. And then I thought, well, I'll try to write a poem. And I pulled those notes and just kind of crossed my fingers and hoped maybe it would veer towards, what we're all going through and experiencing right now. And it did, and then she took it. I'll drop a link into the chat for the anthology for those who might want to investigate it.
Anyone else have a question this evening? Well, we're right at the hour, so it's good timing, everyone. I hope people are taking notes from the chat because there's a really great list of books in there. So there's the anthology. It's great. Well, I want to thank our poets once again and thank everyone for coming out this evening or staying in, as it were. It's been really nice to be together and wonderful to hear some fabulous poetry and continue the celebration of National Poetry Month.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming out, and thank you for having us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.